Welcome back to William on Watch. Inflation is once again in the headlines, though the numbers have yet to fully confirm expectations, so I thought this would be a good time to discuss the topic generally and review the recent past. Like many folks, I enjoyed classes in microeconomics and macroeconomics in college. I didn't learn a whole lot, and I probably have forgotten most of what I did learn. But those classes were beneficial in that they did cause me to think about economics, and the world has been teaching me the subject ever since. Inflation is always a matter of the supply-demand equation in one form or another. When supply remains constant and demand goes up, so does price. When demand remains constant and supply diminishes, price also goes up. And when demand increases and supply is falling, price really goes up. And the reverse is true in the case of deflation. If supply and demand were to remain in equilibrium, price would be constant. But that's only theoretical because in the real world, it never happens. It would be like trying to balance a fishbowl on the tip of a pencil. As the goldfish swims from one side of the bowl to the other, there's no achievable equilibrium, and you just end up with a goldfish flopping around on the floor and a seriously annoyed wife. In the U.S., the president can have tremendous influence on inflation through ill-conceived policy decisions, such as massive tariffs, and Congress can likewise impact inflation. But it's the Federal Reserve Bank that's actually tasked with controlling inflation, which is one component of its dual mandate. It's critical to understand that the Federal Reserve does not take direction from the president. The Fed is specifically charged with keeping unemployment low and inflation creeping ahead. And why does the Fed want minor inflation? One primary reason is that deflation is destructive. It can get out of control very quickly. And since constant equilibrium is not achievable, it's a much safer bet to provide for minor inflation. Describing how this is accomplished starts getting us way out into the tall weeds, so let's save that for another day. Suffice it to say, though, that there is no gizmo sitting on the president's desk in the Oval Office labeled inflation that has an up button and a down button. That will come as big news to many of those people who voted for Trump last November. In the polls I heard, the most commonly reported reason for voting for Trump was the high inflation experienced under Biden. The inflationary period I'm talking about was from very early in 2021 until it peaked, in the U.S. at least, in the summer of 2022. Here's the deal. The primary drivers of that inflation were all COVID-related and impacted all major economies worldwide. Here we see a chart showing HICP inflation. Now, HICP is a standardized Eurozone measure for inflation as compared to CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which can vary by country. So HICP offers a better comparison over a basket of countries like the Eurozone. And here we see the inflation experienced by G7 countries: Canada, the US, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and the UK individually. And the Eurozone collectively is shown as a single dashed line. We can see that the Eurozone, the UK, Germany, and Italy all experienced higher inflation than the US over the same period, while France, Japan, and Canada fared better than the US. And the US was first to peak and first to achieve a significant reduction in inflation. In the next image, we see that by June of 2023, only Canada had achieved lower inflation than that of the US. Now, this chart is based on CPI inflation, so it isn't going to be as accurate for comparison purposes as had it been HICP, but it's probably close enough for our purposes. To prevent an economic collapse during the pandemic, governments, including the U.S., injected massive stimulus into their economies through direct payments, unemployment benefits, and business aid. In the U.S., this was accomplished through congressionally authorized spending and signed into law by the president. Central banks kept interest rates near zero and purchased assets and flooded markets with liquidity in a process known as quantitative easing. This boosted consumer spending and investment, but as the economy reopened, demand definitely outpaced supply, which, as discussed earlier, results in inflation. Oil and gas prices jumped in 2021 as demand returned to the market. Shipping container shortages, port congestion, and a lack of truck drivers and warehouse workers added to delivery delays, disrupting the global supply chain, again resulting in higher prices as businesses passed their rising costs on to consumers across most sectors. Also, low interest rates and a release of pent-up demand led to rising home prices. Then, as home buying became less affordable, demand for rentals surged, resulting in housing inflation. And housing is a major component of inflation indices. Were stimulus measures too extreme? Maybe. But in my opinion, it's better to err on the side of inflation than err on the side of global economic collapse. After all, there's no standard economic protocol for dealing with a highly contagious and deadly virus that keeps morphing into different variants. All in all, I think central banks around the world, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, did a pretty amazing job of stabilizing the global economy. But to hear Donald Trump and congressional Republicans and conservative media say it, inflation was the sole fault of Joe Biden, and that Biden's economy was a disaster. We heard it continuously in the run-up to the 2024 election, and we're still hearing it today.
We are in a period of economic transition. We are in a period of transition from the mess that was created under Joe Biden in the previous administration. Joe Biden left this country in an economic disaster.
That's pretty indicative of what Trump's base hears over and over and over again, which is one reason Trump got reelected. Notice, though, that those folks never cite data to back up their claims. Why not? Because the data says exactly the opposite. Now, Democrats could have explained the causes of inflation to voters, as we just discussed them here, but they chose not to. Again, Democrats just don't get it where it comes to messaging. Substituting a discussion of the origins of inflation with some catchy phrase does absolutely nothing to empower people with the ability to make informed election decisions. The truth is, the U.S. economy recovered from unprecedented peril and was quite strong by the time it was delivered from Joe Biden back into the hands of Donald Trump. Before we take a look at some charts that prove the point, let's be clear on the terminology. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it's a measure of a country's overall economic activity. It's the most often cited determinant of a country's economic health, and it's often stated as a percentage of growth year over year. It's a value that should never be negative. That would be an indicator of something very seriously wrong. By the way, a recession is defined as being 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. In other words, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. So we're only in a recession once that occurs, once there have been 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. In the United States, full employment doesn't mean a 0% unemployment rate. Instead, it refers to a level of unemployment where the economy is operating efficiently without causing inflation to accelerate. Economists often associate this with non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is typically estimated to be at around 4 to 5%. This range accounts for frictional unemployment, such as people transitioning between jobs, and structural unemployment, which are like mismatches between skills and job requirements. Now that we understand that full employment is considered to be at an unemployment rate of about 4 to 5%, let's take a look at unemployment under Biden. Only during his first year, while still very much in the throes of COVID, was unemployment minimally above the threshold for full employment. Unemployment for the other 3 years were at or below the level for statistical full employment. In terms of wage growth, we see that the rapid rise in inflation outpaced wage growth, but wages and inflation began to converge beginning in the summer of 2022 and reversed in February 2023 with wages rising above inflation. Here we see that the average GDP for the U.S. over the last 50 years is 2.59%. The average GDP during the Biden years was 3.09%, while that of Donald Trump's first term was a paltry 1.42%. So the Biden economy was really quite good. During those years, the value of the S&P 500 index rose over 56%, an annual average of over 14%. So 401ks should have risen a similar amount. So under Biden, inflation returned to normal levels before other G7 countries. We had full statistical employment for all of the last 3 years, above average GDP, and 56% increase in 401ks. By any measure, Biden's term was an economic success, particularly considering he took office with COVID in full force. Earlier, I mentioned that the Federal Reserve Bank doesn't fall under the control of the executive branch, and that's for very good reason. Presidents are politicians, and can be deeply influenced by political considerations that can undermine the practical stewardship of monetary policy. As Trump's economy collapses as the result of his erratic tariffs and his move toward isolationism, the Trump administration has taken to bashing Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, so it appears that Powell has been chosen to be the scapegoat for the unfolding economic disaster of Trump's making. Let's keep in mind, though, that it was Trump who nominated Powell to the position in late 2017.
So, at the Fed, we are always focused on the dual mandate goals that Congress has given us: maximum employment and stable prices. Despite heightened uncertainty and downside risks, the U.S. economy is still in a solid position. The labor market is at or near maximum employment. Inflation has come down a great deal, but is still running a bit above our 2% objective. Turning briefly to the incoming data, we'll get the initial reading on first quarter GDP in a couple of weeks. The data we have in hand so far suggests that growth has slowed in the first quarter of this year from last year's solid pace. Despite strong motor vehicle sales, overall consumer spending appears to have grown modestly. In addition, strong imports during the first quarter, reflecting attempts by businesses to get ahead of potential tariffs, are expected to weigh on GDP growth. Surveys of households and businesses report a sharp decline in sentiment and elevated uncertainty about the outlook, largely reflecting trade policy concerns. Outside forecasts for the full year are coming down, and for the most part point to continued slowing but still positive growth. We are closely tracking incoming data as households and businesses continue to digest these developments.
Jerome Powell's term as Fed chairman will be up in May of 2026, at which time Trump will nominate a new chairman. If Trump holds to his preference for nominating folks who are loyal rather than competent, we could end up with a Fed chair named like Don Jr. or Walt Nauta. But whoever's selected, you can bet that Donald Trump will be the de facto chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. A very frightening prospect indeed. So we'll gauge Trump's management of the economy in future episodes, but it sure ain't looking good right now. So please take just a sec to hit the subscribe button. It's right up here. And please join the conversation in the comments below. Until next time, fair winds.